Welcome to the Bronx African American History Project. My name is Steven Payne, librarian and archivist at the Bronx County Historical Society, and I'm here with Peter B., an erstwhile resident of the Coops, or the United Workers Cooperative Colony, located at 2700 Bronx Park East. So we begin these oral history interviews by asking, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and how they ended up in the Bronx?
Hello, Stephen. Peter B. here. Would you like me to answer some of the questions that I see that you have? Like my parents' names and how they met?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't say those pieces of information in your answer at first, I'll ask them afterwards. But oftentimes people will share that information just naturally with the first question, and then I'll just skip over those other questions if they share them. So it's more just a guide. So I make sure to ask a lot of different details if they don't come up naturally. But yeah, so just why don't you just start with your parents' names, their first names, that is, and what you know about their background, how they ended up in New York, how they ended up in the Bronx, just a general overview of the history of your parents as you know it anyway.
Okay, so that'll take an hour.
Good, I'm here.
Not really. So we've got two different heritages going on. We've got my mother's side, a woman who was Jewish and who actually was born in the Ukraine and came over in 1905 after the pogroms or during the pogroms in the Ukraine.
Sure.
And ended up in Connecticut, Hartford area, in a tobacco farm, essentially.
Oh, wow.
Those were the young years for that family.
Sure.
So she had a sister, Nan, who was 2 years older. And so it was the two of them plus their parents. And that's just a quick and dirty in terms of my mom coming over. In terms of my dad, it's more complicated because he was a Black man, and in trying to understand his history, it gets very confusing when you start going back in time and you realize that at some point we're dealing with slavery and we're dealing with people who don't necessarily have names, but they may have baby boy, and the last name may not be a real name. It may be the name taken by the free Black people.
Sure.
And typically it would have been the foreman a lot of times. So my father was born in Mississippi, and he was a sole child. And again, I don't think that his birth was recorded. And so the way that we have his birth is from a testament from someone who said that they were there at the birth, and it would have been September 7th, 1909. Now, whether that's the real date or not, we don't know. But my mother's birthday was December 1st, 1904. So there was a difference in age, not much. With my ex-wife is trying to she's gone down to Mississippi.
Wow.
She's trying to figure out how my father and that family and that clan worked. And it's very confusing because there are various sources of misinformation, we think, are misinformation. What we know is that my father moved to the north via Washington, D.C., He said that he went to Howard for a period of time, although I've not been able to verify that. Neither of my parents went to college, as far as I know.
Sure.
If my father did go to Howard, then I would be wrong in saying neither of my parents, but I don't believe that he did.
Mm.
I was told by them that they met in a singing group. They were both musical people and met in a left-wing singing group. And I would love to know more about that if we could.
Yeah.
But at this point, I don't know how we would. They were older when they got married, older than what was typical for the age. They were about 35-ish, again, 5-year difference. So my mom was 35, dad was younger. They were married 5 years before I was born.
Mm.
And so let's say that would have been, put my mother at 40. I remember, I'm the only child. I remember wanting to have a brother or sister. And I think that occurred to me, I'm guessing, maybe when I was 8 or 9.
Sure.
And so, here I am talking to my parents about having a brother or sister when my mother might have been going through menopause.
Yeah.
I mean, it was unrealistic to think that could happen, but I remember feeling like an only child.
Yeah.
And wishing that I had other people, even though I did have a lot of other people in my life, but no bro or sister. My parents lived, before they moved to the Coops, they lived with my grandmother on my mom's side, 3136 Perry Avenue. 3136 Perry Avenue was off of Marshallview Parkway. And so until they moved to the Coops, they were there.
I see. And were you born when they had already moved to the Coops?
Yes, I was born in the Coops. I could give you a date, but that would be very specific.
Sure. How about just a year?
1945.
1945. Okay.
So I'm right now 76. I'm looking and seeing, what did your parents do for a living? Shall we do that?
Yeah. That's a good place to go next.
My father worked in Brooklyn in Biltrite Baby Carriage Company, putting wheels on baby carriages.
Sure.
We lived in Northeast Bronx. That was a trek.
That is a trek. That's probably at least an hour and 15 hour and 30 minutes by subway, I imagine.
And he would not take the subway.
Oh, okay.
He took his black Oldsmobile, 88 or 98. Those were the model numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So he was this gas guzzler that he would take to work every morning. He made 65, if I remember correctly, it was $65 a week, which sounds like it should be a lot when you compare it to today's numbers.
Sure.
But it really wasn't a lot. And so maybe he earned less than that. But I know that he had dignity.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that people looked up to him. He wasn't a tall man, but he was rotund. He was likened to Paul Robeson for a lot of reasons. Big black man with a bass baritone voice who had a laugh that was infectious, and he had a voice that was like Paul Robeson. And so in our neighborhood, in the Coops, he became somewhat of a celebrity because people knew that he would sing at events.
Yeah.
And so he couldn't come home from walking in the streets without meeting X number of people and talking to them and then wanting to say whatever and talk to your wife and say hi. And so he would come home and he would say to my mom, so I just met with whomever, and he would not remember the name because there were so many different people, and it was just kind of funny.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
so somebody says hello, who? I don't remember, but she or he, but he was very popular.
And
My mom worked in local 76B, which is the Furniture Workers Union,
mm,
in the pension fund. And so in a way, they worked in a similar environment
sure.
where my father was doing the furniture worker as a furniture worker, but he was a shop steward. And so he would have to come over to the union and interact with the union. My mom was in charge of the pension fund. And so there was some interaction there that they could bring home and talk about work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And were either or both of them very politically engaged that you remember as a child?
My parents had uh, beliefs, and the beliefs were, I think they were coming from the history, mom's history. She came over in '05, as I mentioned, and the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. And I think what that family saw was what they were interested in,
Yeah.
which was equality. I mean, again, whatever happened with socialism/communism may have been changed was changed over the years.
Yeah.
So their understanding, I take it, that they were thinking of black and white together, we shall not be moved, looks like a tree. So they were, I think, ideologically invested in a lot of the tenets that socialism/communism sounded like that it would offer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
A freedom of races, a freedom of men and women, all of a utopia that was talked about in that Coops movie that we realized was a lot more complicated than the way that it was presented.
Sure.
So how political were they? In theory, they were political, but in practice, they were political only in the sense of integration
Mm-hmm.
and peace.
Sure.
So my mom was mothers for, well, I can't remember, the women's strike for peace might have been
Sure.
one thing, but she was always involved with, my father was not as involved at all, but my mom was. I grew up seeing my mom on picket lines,
Yeah.
going on marches, and that's, growing up in the Coops, we had a lot of people who had similar ideals, and so it was almost expected of us
Yeah.
to be going down to the next march. It was a social thing as well as a political thing.
Sure.
You went down with your friends to march in Washington, either against the war, depending on whatever it was, the war in Vietnam or integration. My parents never went down to the South to do anything,
Sure.
but I did.
I see.
I went down to Selma, and I went down to Bogalusa.
Wow.
And there's a whole story about that we could talk about at another time. I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Yeah.
But I was the product of their ideals
Absolutely.
and ideas. But I believed in it as well.
Sure.
Which is why I put myself on the line. And so I was very much involved with integration and peace. And it was almost automatic in a way that if there was a march on Washington, we would be, my friends and I would be going down.
Sure. Sure.
What elementary school did I go to? So I lived in the Northeast Bronx, and I went to, can I do this?
Oh, yeah.
So I lived in the Northeast Bronx, which is the 5th time I've said that, and walked to school. It was a local neighborhood school, PS 96.
Yeah, that's the standard answer for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of myself, I was told somewhere in the elementary grades that I was smart enough to go into a program that was called the SPs.
I've
may or may not be familiar with the SPs, but it was special progress.
That's right.
And what it meant was that instead of going to the junior high school that I would have gone to, which would have been 135, I went to junior high school 113. Junior high school 113, I had to take myself out of the neighborhood along with other people who were in the same SPs. And we took a train to Gun Hill Road. You know anything about Gun Hill Road, you know that I'm outside of my environment.
Definitely.
As we all were.
Definitely.
And so SP was one name, but we were called special pricks by anybody else, out of jealousy, out of animosity, out of the fact that we were in a group that was accelerated.
Yeah.
And so we actually had to leave together and come back together because people were waiting for us.
Yeah.
We were outside of our safety zone.
You're not the first person who's identified that neighborhood in particular as a dangerous one for those precise reasons. Yeah. There's actually multiple other interviews where people remember being chased home, whether it was from that junior, JHS 113, or I think people remember being harassed by, kids from that neighborhood at Christopher Columbus, which is, not exactly, it's a little bit away from that neighborhood, but if they went to the same school, I remember one guy said he would have to run home, which was like a 2.5 mile run from him because he lived a little outside of the neighborhood. So yeah, that neighborhood has been mentioned by plenty of other people as
it's Gun Hill Road, and they had a movie about Gun Hill Road called Gun Hill Road.
Yeah.
And I took my son and daughter-in-law back home 2 or 3 years ago, and we took a tour of all of the places. My daughter-in-law was very interested in my life, and so we went to Gun Hill Road, and we felt it. We got the experience of what Gun Hill Road was like. Very busy, very transient. Okay, so there was that. What elementary school? And so I went to junior high school 113, and what I realized was, and most of the other students who were in the SPs, went to Bronx High School of Science.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I felt like I knew that there was something different about me.
Sure.
And that difference was not being Black or being Jewish.
Yeah.
It was one other issue that I could not share with anybody.
Yeah, yeah.
I felt like I could not share it with anybody. I felt like it was going to be a secret that would take me for the rest of my life.
Sure.
And that was that there was something going on between my attraction to other boys. And, you know, we're talking about so many years ago.
Yeah.
When I think about that, Steven, do you know that it was 1967 that the Brits, the United Kingdom, changed their laws and made it so that you wouldn't go to jail. In 1968 or 7 was when they changed those laws. So I was 22 at that time,
Yeah.
or 23.
Yeah.
So, you know, the idea of, I mean, I don't even think the term gay was something that I was thinking in terms of.
Sure.
I just knew that I had to be careful about this secret.
Yeah.
And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that I felt like I knew I wanted to be a doctor. I've wanted to be a doctor from whenever I could remember. And one of the reasons I wanted to be a doctor was because of a camp that I had gone to. And a woman doctor was somebody that I really looked up to. And when there was some family member that had cancer, and I was very naive. I wanted to cure cancer. I wanted to help people. I wanted to be a doctor.
Sure.
So that was something that I didn't even know what that really meant.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is that I wasn't pushed by my parents. My parents didn't push me to want to be, I want you to be a doctor. No, none of that. I want you to be happy.
Yeah.
And so I didn't feel pressure from them. And so what happened, instead of me going to Bronx High School of Science, I said, I want to be normal. How does one become, quote, normal? You don't go to the Bronx High School of Science. I went to Christopher Columbus High School.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And so what I did was I acted out all of the things that gave me acceptance.
Sure.
In terms of normality, normalcy, whatever the correct term might be. And that means that I was fast. So I was on the track team, and I was the fastest runner on the track team, which kept me safe outside of school as well, because I was the fastest sprinter.
Yeah.
And you talked about the guy 2.5 miles or however many miles, whatever it was. You know, growing up in the Bronx, I could say to you that I was never involved in a fight.
Yeah.
With one exception that I could talk about another time, never involved in a fight. I would either use my head to get out of it, or I'd use my feet.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I never got beaten up, and neither did I I didn't even know how to box.
Sure.
But I was wiry, and I was a good wrestler. I was thin but strong. And if I needed to, I could get out of a headlock and I could, run away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So back to Christopher Columbus High School. I was the track star. I was the GO president. The school had about 4,000 students. I ran for president, GO president, and won. Again, I'm just trying to be accepted.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm looking back now and I'm seeing how I put this together.
Sure.
So I was president, and I was track star, and I was in baseball, and in class, I was a cutout.
Yeah.
I was trying to do what everybody else was doing, but I could do it in a way that I stood out more as, because I was using my brain, they saw, I don't know how to say this without sounding like I'm bragging, but I
Just say
became,
it anyway.
well, I became more of the star cutout.
Yeah.
I was able to, they found me funny.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And so I gained acceptance in those ways. Um, and what happened was I did so well in those areas. Scholastically, I didn't do well at all because that that wasn't really what I was going for. I was going for something else.
Sure. Sure.
I was going for being accepted. And so I remember a few things. One, I didn't get into uh, one of the city colleges. Hunter would have been the one that I would have gone to.
Hmm.
I didn't get into Hunter College day school because of my grades. And that was a wake-up call for me.
Yeah.
I went to Hunter on 68th and Park in Manhattan, night school, and realized, Peter, you said you wanted to be a doctor. Look at where you are. You're not even in day school.
Yeah.
So I had to turn my life around. And by turning my life around, let's start with some things that I learned.
Sure.
Is this okay? Are we doing, is
This
this
is
what you want to
perfect.
do?
Yeah. 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 This is perfect.
I remember in French in Columbus High School that they should have flunked me. I really shouldn't have passed French. And one of the reasons why I didn't do well in French was because, in a way, je parle français, and when you start speaking it, you're making yourself less manly, quote unquote,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
some people,
Yeah.
to some people. And so I didn't want to put myself out there like that.
Sure.
And so I should have failed, but because I had the Regents exam, which was the state exam, if you got over a certain number, then they couldn't fail you. They had to pass you. But what I got out of that was that I was awful at languages.
Yeah.
And therefore, when I went to Hunter Night School, I didn't want to continue with French. So I started another language, and it was Spanish. The reason I'm mentioning that is because it taught me something that I have tried to teach other people in life. I am awful in languages. I know that. I've seen that. That's from high school. And so I had to work double hard, triple hard in Spanish. And what happened was that, you take a course in Spanish or French or any foreign language, and you don't really learn how to speak.
Very
You may
true.
learn
Yeah.
how to read. You may learn how to conjugate, but you can't necessarily put ideas. I worked so hard that I confounded both the instructor and myself because I was actually able to speak Spanish.
Wow.
And so what I got out of that, Steven, was that if you don't put yourself down and think that you can't do something, have faith in yourself and keep trying. You may fall down, but keep trying. And so what happened in my life, this is now the rest of my life, is that I have become fluent in 5 languages.
Wow.
Throughout life. But I would never have known that if I had that in my head that I was awful in languages.
Sure.
And so I try to talk to people again about be careful about what you think you can't do.
Yeah.
You might very well be able to do it. Don't give up on yourself. And so people typically when I travel, I don't travel as an American. I
Sure.
can look like anything. If I go to South America, I'll look like South American.
Yeah.
When I don't shave, and I was over in the Middle East, they thought I was a Lebanese terrorist. Um, and so when I'm in a country, I will learn the language of that country enough so that I will not speak any English, and I will immerse myself in the culture.
Sure.
And if that means that I'm making a fool of myself because I'm using the wrong terminology, they'll help me.
Yeah.
I mean, they are thinking, he's an American who's trying. Let me help you.
That's light years ahead of pretty much most other Americans. So
Oh, yeah. I mean, Americans they think they don't need to speak any other language. I'm an American. You speak English. But for me, my second home was Puerto Rico um, slash Brazil.
oh, okay, sure.
I had a condominium I'm really getting ahead of
Oh,
myself.
that's fine. That's fine. We'll loop back around.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had a condominium in Puerto Rico, and I bought that for my parents so that they could have 6 months of winter in Puerto Rico and then 6 months around Marshall Parkway, 5 Minerva Place, actually.
Okay, sure.
Um, so in Brazil, I also had a condo
Mm.
and spent a lot of time down there. There was someone special that I would be visiting. And so I essentially, when I would travel, I would either be speaking Portuguese in Brazil or Spanish in any other Spanish speaking country.
Yeah.
And when I went to Italy, I was able to go for a long period of time.
Mm.
I had a tutor. Whatever I needed to do to be able to speak as fluently as I could.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, I was successful.
Wow.
And there were times when Americans might come up to me and I would be not letting them know that I was American. I would be speaking in broken English
Yeah.
to them. And I would hear them translating what I said to their friends and mistranslating.
Yeah.
They were saying what they wanted. Like they asked me, where's a place to go? And I would tell them choices. And I could hear him, I mean, this was one particular instance, say just whatever. I didn't say that. And so the next day when I saw this guy, I said, I speak very good English, yes? He says, yeah, you speak. I said, I speak, yes, good to you yesterday. Yeah, yes, you were very good, very good. And I said, reason that I speak so good is because I'm an American and that's my natural language. And I also heard you yesterday and, freaked the guy out. Uh, uh, and he said, oh my God, so you understood everything I was saying? Of course I understood everything you were saying. And I was just curious as to why you were changing what I was saying so that you got your way. So I did go out of character there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Only because I did.
Yeah. So, going back to your parents, did you get your devious sense of humor from either of them, or what were their personalities like? You shared a bit about your father, kind of affable, a laughter that could kind of infect the room, but
A belly laugh.
Yeah, belly laugh. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know about belly laughs for
yeah,
sure. I have a bit of one, but
yeah. And some of it might have been uh, an exaggeration.
sure.
You know,
Yeah.
I have a son who has a laugh that we all look at and go, Chris, come on. Is that a laugh or are you? um, Personalities. My mom was an extremely warm and loving and giving person.
Mm,
Uh, if she had a reputation, it was just that.
sure.
And going back a generation to my grandmother on my mom's side, she also was stern.
Mm,
She not also. She was stern, but loving and a practical nurse who would try to help others. But my mom and my aunt were very different. My aunt was more into politics. Nan
mm,
was her name. She lived on 3136 Perry Avenue and was more active than my parents
okay, I see.
in whatever, if it were a party, she was more active in terms of that.
Sure.
She was also she was colder than my mom. And so there was quite a difference that
Yeah.
we could feel.
Yeah.
Uh, I think my dad had some issues with inferiority.
Mm,
Um, and I could understand why. Growing up in the South
yeah.
at, at that period of time, um, not being educated, I don't know what type of education he might have had. See, the problem that I had, Stephen, is that I was born when my parents were about 40.
Sure.
And so if it were 20 years earlier, like other people, I might have had a chance to have asked them a lot of questions
Yeah. Yeah.
after I established my own life.
Sure.
But when they were 40 and I was going out and then going to medical school and then moving to Georgetown and having a family,
Yeah.
my parents were getting older and older. My father was getting senile.
Sure.
Um, it became harder and harder to try to get a history.
Yeah.
I do remember um, asking my dad what I consider simple things. And I'm simplifying it even more now. For instance, I would ask him how to spell cat.
Yeah.
I, this this is erroneous. I would not ask him that. But
Sure. Sure.
and what he would say is ask your mother, ask your mom. So I resented that.
Yeah.
I felt like, Dad, I'm asking you. Why can't you? I didn't finish the sentence, but you could probably see where I was going.
Yeah.
And so it was frustrating for me. So there was a distance there. And the distance now I look at and go, God, I really wish if I only knew then what I know now,
Sure.
everybody has that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hindsight. He was a man who was doing the best that he could, supporting his family, um, trying to be and was a good provider and father, but we were not close.
Sure. Sure.
If you know the Coops, you know that right across the street is the Bronx Park.
Yeah.
And I mean right across the street. And so I could either go on one side where it was neighborhood, or I could go on the other side where it was open space.
Yeah.
And who else would be able to take advantage of walking across the street but those people on Bronx Park East.
I know.
And I lived on Bronx Park East.
Unless you're one of the millionaires who lives right by Central Park.
Exactly.
Otherwise, forget about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it was safe for me as a kid growing up to go to the park.
Yeah.
My parents weren't worried about me going to the park. And so I did spend a lot of time on the other side where it was safer, I thought, than in the neighborhood.
Sure.
Even though the neighborhood was safe.
Yeah.
But one of the other things was kind of like Kevin Costner, that question that he asked his dad, you want to have a catch? If you remember that, that's always moved me, as it moves a lot of men that have father issues. Because I wanted my dad to have a catch with me.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a black man who knew how to play baseball. We did bond around Jackie Robinson, around going to Ebbets Field. Forget the frickin' Yankees.
Yeah.
The white team. We went to Brooklyn and went to Ebbets Field. And so I was abandoned at whatever age by the Brooklyn Dodgers, who decided to move over to Los Angeles, and even the Giants, who went up to SFO.
56, 58, I forget which year, but yeah.
It tore my heart. I mean, that was my team.
Yeah. In Bronx Park, what are some of the things that you would do there, whether summer or winter? Are there particular things you do in each season, or just wander around?
I play ball with friends. That's a lot of what we would do, would be to play ball or to ride our bikes. I had a bike, friends had a bike. There was a bike path. And so we'd ride.
Sure.
Again, riding in the city.
Yeah.
But riding in the park, I'm not worried about getting hit.
Yeah, definitely.
And so it was almost an ideal life. My parents did not have a lot of money. I remember that they paid $43 a month rent.
Yeah.
In that rent-controlled unit. We never talked about bedrooms. We talked about rooms. And so we lived in a 3-room apartment.
Okay, I see.
For the first, I'm guessing, maybe 10 years of my life.
Yeah.
A living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen.
Okay, yeah.
My parents slept in the bedroom. So where do I sleep? So for the first, let's say, 10 years of my life, I slept in the living room.
Sure.
Until my parents went to bed. And then my father would pick me up and take me out of their bed. Take me out of the living room. Yeah, take me out of their bed and put me in the other room.
Sure.
And I remember there were times when I was not sleeping, but just to be picked up and moved by my dad was good enough.
Yeah.
So I would fake sleep. And at some point, that was 3-room. At some point, we moved to Bronx Park East. So the first place was Barker Avenue.
Sure.
On one block, east of Bronx Park East, let's call it east. One block on the other side of the Coops.
Yeah.
Then we moved to 2814 Bronx Park East, and I was much closer to the park, and it didn't matter. I mean, just walk through the courtyard. The Coops were beautiful. People would go out of their way to tend their gardens. If you take a look at the tile work of some of the earlier pictures, you see that, it took 2 city blocks, and it was quite nice. I mean, it was beautiful. We had the projects across the street.
Yeah, yeah.
So we could see what projects looked like. Um, and the people in the projects were a multitude of ideals and ideas.
Sure.
But the people in the coops pretty much were of similar beliefs. Uh, um, shoot.
Were you close friends with other children in the Coops, or were most of your friends from just from school, or where were your close friends from?
So it's a variety. My parents didn't have much money, as I said. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that they felt like, although they didn't have that much money, they were going, I was an only child,
Yeah.
they were going to do whatever it took to send me to camp for the summer.
Sure.
So every year I would go to summer camp. And those summer camps were left wing, and either Kinderland or Oleana or Webatuck or Unity, Camp Unity, they were all left wing
Sure.
camps. Some adult, like Unity, and some just for kids, like Kinderland, which you may have heard of, know
Yes,
about.
definitely.
A lot of people went to Kinderland. And so I was able to have, again, being an only child, I think they were thinking in terms of, I don't want you to be spoiled. I want you to learn how to share. So that's one reason. The other is, I want you out of this, I'd like you in an environment where you can be with other people and just spend the summer outside of New York.
Definitely.
So I felt really lucky to be able to do that. And so pretty much every summer I was away. So you asked about friends. I had friends from the Coops. Arnold Molina, Steven Yabek was across the street, not in the Coops. I don't think that his family did not agree with the philosophies of the Coops, but he was one of my friends.
Sure.
He also outed me at a later time. Right. Outed me in terms of, I know your parents go to the ALP, American Labor Party, because it was on Allerton Avenue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he did that in a group of my friends, and they weren't necessarily Coops people. They were from wherever, because again, Steven Yabek was not part of the Coops, but he was one of my friends. Embarrassed the hell out of me.
Sure.
Because if you think about it, at that period of time, McCarthyism.
Yeah.
And the Red Menace and the Red Scare. I learned from PS 96 the communists killed people, tortured people, were bad people. And so I came home and asked my parents, are you bad? Do you kill people? Are you bad people? I mean, I was confused.
Yeah, sure.
I was trying to understand how what I was learning in school, I couldn't necessarily tell these teachers that my parents were that if they were telling me that that was bad.
Yeah.
I remember my mom, the FBI would come to our house.
Sure, yeah,
and what they wanted was to have people inform on other people.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I was instructed as to how to act when the FBI came to the door and to answer no questions. And because both my parents worked,
sure.
And although there was childcare up to a certain point in time, we didn't have childcare when I got to a certain age, and I can't tell you what age that was, but
yeah,
it was the kind of thing where, Peter, if you have an emergency, call 911.
Yeah, definitely.
And I remember poor Johnny Arceri who was in my house, and he wouldn't leave. And I thought, I was a kid, and I thought that was an emergency.
Yeah.
And I called 911, and the cops came. And I said, he won't leave. I mean, it was embarrassing now. And it was, I didn't have a governor,
Yeah.
a way of knowing what was a true emergency.
Sure.
So
You're
it
still
came
learning
out.
at that time. Yeah.
Right. So poor Johnny Arcerian. Yeah, we were good friends, and we remain
That's
good
funny.
friends.
Did the FBI agents ever come into your apartment? And
No,
okay, yeah,
no, they were never allowed in.
yeah. There's one story that I've heard a couple different versions of about Angie, where either one or two FBI agents, depending on who's telling the story, come knocking on her door, posing as
Full of brush, man?
salespeople.
Full of brush?
Oh,
Maybe.
maybe. Yeah.
'Cause that's who would also come, was the full of brush people.
Yeah. So one person said maybe from Macy's, but they weren't sure. Another person didn't share that they were posing as salespeople, but they came posing at it. She lets them in, sits them on the couch, calls the company that they said they were from in their earshot. And, they say, no, we didn't send anyone. And she stands in front of her door with either a broom or a knife and tells them to jump out the window because she was on the first floor. So they didn't want to go through her, I guess. But yeah, I mean, this is a constant refrain that many people, I mean, people who whose parents were very politically engaged, people whose parents were less politically engaged, but lived in the Coops, and one or both of their parents were Black. This is something that has come up repeatedly, just the constant threat of surveillance by the FBI, which I think was going on in a lot of different communities, but the degree of surveillance in the Coops.
Well, of course, and it would make sense. Willie Hutton,
Yeah.
Willie Sutton. Why do you rob banks? You go where the money is.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
The Coops. You can go where the money is.
Yeah, for sure. But so you mentioned the American Labor Party. Your parents were involved in the American Labor Party, I take it,
Yes.
at some point.
Yes.
Yeah. I think I remember. I don't think it was an American Labor Party event, but I remember seeing your father listed as the singer for an event at the American Labor Party
Really?
meeting room. Yeah. It was in. I'll get it. I found it just Friday when I got off the phone with you, and I'll send it your way. But it has his name listed. Was someone else maybe from the Coops as the entertainment, but he's the top billed performer.
Oh my God, that's. Let me tell you what happened to any records that I don't think we talked about this before. So now we're later on in life.
Sure.
My kids are about 16 years old. I am now an international speaker. And so I would have typically yearly speaking engagements in Hawaii.
Wow.
And then in other places in the US. But when I was invited to Hawaii every year, I got bored with Hawaii. I mean, I got paid to go there. And so what I did was I would take that money and then I would go further.
Yeah.
And so I would go to the Philippines, or I'd go to Thailand, or I'd go to Australia. I would go and see the world.
Sure.
And then come back to Hawaii. And the reason I'm mentioning this to you is because on one of those trips, I came back and my parents were in Puerto Rico, and I called to say that I was back in the mainland. Well, sorry, back in the US. I wasn't back in the mainland, I was in Hawaii, but I was somewhere else in the, Far East earlier. And I remember it was a 5-minute call, and there's a reason as to why I remember it. But when I finally got from Hawaii to San Francisco, I had to overnight in San Francisco before I went to New York. And I asked them to give me a wake-up call. They gave me a wake-up call, but it wasn't a wake-up call. It was my aunt telling me that my mother died.
Oh boy.
So here I am now in San Francisco, having to change all my plans, call my kids. They were old enough that they met me in Puerto Rico. I went straight to Puerto Rico because my father was senile, and essentially my mom died in the apartment, in the condominium. No ambulance. Again, we don't know all of the circumstances, but if I were to put it together as a physician, she either had a PE, pulmonary embolus, or an MI,
I see.
heart attack, myocardial infarction. But whatever it was, my aunt lived in their apartment for that 6 months. And so a Minerva place. And then she would move up when they would come back. She would move up to Followers of the Trail, which is in Peekskill, around Peekskill.
Okay. I've heard of that place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm mentioning this to you is because my aunt, we were all overwhelmed.
Yeah.
My mother wasn't sick, and so the death was a shock.
Yeah.
It was such a shock to her sister, to my aunt, that instead of doing what I would have considered the right thing, she did the expedient thing, and that is she threw everything out.
Yeah. Mm.
All of the memorabilia that I should have gotten, that I would have gotten. I remember tapes my father had of his singing.
Yeah.
With groups, with Blue, this man who maybe Blue's name was part of, I don't think he would have been part of the ALP. Maybe he was, but I know that they sang together.
Okay, I see.
And so what I'm saying is I've lost all that.
Yeah.
And that's why if you have anything that relates to that era and my father and or my mom, please send it to me, because we are trying to gather, that's where we got this information from the USO, is that my ex-wife has been researching.
Sure. I don't know if this is something you'd want to share in this context, maybe afterwards, but I realize I don't think I know your mother's name, her first name.
Okay. Our first name was Bertha.
Okay. That's good.
Never to be called Bertha again, except for specific reasons like driver's license.
Yeah.
Her name was something that was so unusual that her name was Babe.
Okay, I see. That's what she went by, huh?
From a kid on. And so the idea, I'm thinking now, grown men would talk to my mom, "Hey, babe." It's, you think about it, and the word babe, you don't just call somebody babe.
Yeah.
But that was my mom's name.
Yeah.
So it's Solemn Babe.
I see. Okay. Yeah. That's good to know. I haven't tried your mom and some of the, databases that I use, but definitely found a few, I think, additional things for your father, and I'll
that's
send
wonderful
to you. I'd love to stumble across, a recording that he's on that might not have his name listed on the cover, but if he's
like you mentioned.
Yeah, we'll see. That's something I'll continue to search for in the months and years to come, because this this project is definitely a long-term one that's kind of my passion project, if you will. So, but yeah, so
Stephen, how are we doing in terms of what I'm saying to you? Is this the information? Am I
yes, yeah,
digressing too much,
no,
or
this is perfect. I mean,
there's okay?
because uh, there definitely are some oral histories that go in a very linear kind of question by question fashion, but the best kind, in my experience, are more circuitous because a lot of things come out that way that might not come out if you're just going down the list of questions. Memories are weird, a very weird and potent thing like that. Um, so this is actually the perfect way. Ideally, this is how oral histories, all of them would go, but just depends on who's speaking. So yeah, why don't we
Let me ask you something. May I interrupt?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Are you interested in my life post Coops,
Yeah,
or is it really just around the Coops? Because a lot of things have happened post Coops that relate back to how I was brought up.
absolutely. So I'm interested in the whole picture. There's some people who might not want to share, as much and just kind of want to stick with the Coops or the Bronx. If they moved out of the Coops to other parts of the Bronx and want to talk about that too. But I think the larger picture of someone's life that you can get from these, the more useful they are, because you can see how these experiences shaped someone's life going forward. But so it's up to you. I would love to learn as much about your life, the entirety of it, as possible. But I also want to respect whatever boundaries you might um, want to honor.
Well, one of the things that struck me about my life is that there were things that happened in my life. Let me back up. We were not religious in any way, although I did go to shul.
Sure. Yeah.
So I did go to shul and I did learn the alphabet. But hold on a second.
Sure.
I'm a diabetic and my meter just dropped and I'm
Oh, okay. Yeah.
trying to see what number it is. So that is as far as I might have. I don't even know if there was a Bible in the house.
Yeah.
And so I grew up without any stories, without any bits of information that may go into people's heads as a young age, and that's their belief system.
Sure.
And so what happened to me was that there was a movie that I happened to see in Tacoma, in Seattle, when I was teaching in Tacoma. I was with a friend in the movie, and I was bringing him back home, and I was going to my hotel, and I said, Chris, it was Jesus of Montreal was the movie.
Mm.
And I said, I really don't, there was a lot that I didn't understand because I never was taught any of the stages of the cross, etc. He said, well, you got to book in your hotel. It's a Sheraton. You got to book in your hotel. Why don't you pick it up? Stephen, that changed my life.
Mm.
That movie and that conversation, I went to the hotel. I opened the book up. I started to look at it. And I read a few pages, and then I went, wait a minute. They just said this over here, and now they're just saying this over here. They just said this over here, now they're saying this over here. And so for, I would say, the next 12 years or so, I was immersed. I went to Iliff School of Theology.
Mm.
I had a tutor that we went over the whole, pretty much the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The reason I'm mentioning this to you is that in addition to teaching medicine and other things, I taught on the Metro campus the Bible as literature in the English department.
Sure.
And what I realized was how little people understood about the book that they thought they believed in.
Absolutely.
And how historically I understood now how the historicity occurred. And I think other people were thinking that it was occurring as they were reading it.
Yeah.
That, versus 1,000 years later, that it was an oral history that was going on.
Yeah.
And so that oral history could have been changed over a period of time until it was written.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how I got off on that tangent other than, how did I get off on that? Do you remember?
So let's see.
It had to
Let
do
me
with
trace it back here. So I guess maybe the fact that there wasn't a Bible in your household and you weren't, your family wasn't in any way religious. That's the, I think, jumping off point.
Okay.
Yeah. But I imagine, I'm sure that allowed you to have very fresh eyes when you did approach, the Bible as opposed to someone who is raised in it.
Absolutely.
And, they come with all kinds of kind of anecdotes and all kinds of baggage as to what it
Well,
could
they
be.
have been going to Sunday school maybe and learning about things the way they were taught, depending on if they were Baptist or Southern Baptist or whatever their sect would be. Whereas you're right, I felt like I was able to take a few steps back and look at it historically and talk about some of the things that the Bible would talk about, the Asherah. So don't you go next to stop at the Asherah.
Sure.
That doesn't mean anything to anybody, maybe, but I understood what it meant.
Yeah.
It was a remnant of goddess religions.
Yeah.
In the past. So there were goddess religions before there were patriarchs. And, what the Bible was saying, what the writers were saying is you have one God and one God only. So don't have an amulet underneath your saddle.
Sure.
Or, the people were going, yeah, I'll believe in Yahweh, but I'll also believe in the Canaan and Baal, and I'll, the various other godlike figures that were there.
Done what most people throughout history have done, which is kind of take whatever benefit they can get from whatever gods and goddesses there might be.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, so how about I think this, since we're speaking kind of in general about culture broadly understood right now, what about music in your household? I mean, we've talked about your father being a singer, but what kinds of music do you remember listening to growing up?
Music was a very big part of our lives. We would always be singing. My father would sing Negro spirituals.
Sure.
But he was also in Porgy and Bess, as you know, so he'd be singing some of the songs from there. And again, his voice was, I can't say it was indistinguishable from Paul Robeson, but to me, his voice was Paul Robeson.
Yeah. Wow.
And he was my dad.
Yeah.
And as you said, you saw his name in the ALP, but he was busy.
Yeah.
And so what was interesting was that I would go to camp every year, and a big part of camp was singing.
Sure.
And so I was a natural harmonizer. And so I would have the best time with songs. And I eventually learned the guitar, took lessons from somebody who was a professional, a finger picker. If you ever heard Happy or Artie Traum, if you ever heard those names, those are people that are still, some I think they're still alive, but the point is that they were pretty famous and expensive. And so Peter Weissman, I think I don't know if I mentioned his name, he lived outside of the Coops, but we were joined at the hip in terms of the camps that we went to,
Sure.
and the parents were friends. Peter and I shared guitar lessons, and so I was able to be quite proficient in the guitar, doing stuff, finger picking, that, you know, I could do stuff that impressed other people, so that I became known as a good singer, guitar player, and eventually went out on my own.
Yeah.
And went to coffee houses and sang.
Wow.
When we got married, when Jackie and I were married, we got married and then we didn't have a reception at that time. We went to California.
Sure.
Right after our marriage. Please remember, let's put a tag in getting married with Jackie.
Yeah.
When we came back, we had a reception. And I remember it was in one of the left-wing places where the three of us, my father, my mother, and I, got up on stage and we sang.
Oh, wow.
So we entertained everybody. And that was, you know, I almost never, there's a movie and a book called I Never Sang for My Father. That's kind of like me. I sang for everybody else, but I would not want him to hear me. I think because I was intimidated.
Yeah.
Because he was my father and I didn't have that kind of voice.
Sure.
Or at least so I thought. So the one time that they did hear me sing was we had a concert here in Colorado with, it was a duet, and about 500 people attended, and my father was in the audience, and my parents were able to hear us. I made the mistake, Steven, of saying that my father was in the audience and that he was a singer. Oh my God. Get him up on stage, get him up on stage. So he got up on stage, and my father didn't need any accompaniment. As a matter of fact, he didn't use accompaniment. It was all just him.
Sure.
And he got up on stage, and then I was thinking, am I going to be able to get back up on stage?
After.
I mean, this man has taken over the show. You know, he knows how to entertain, and he's doing it. And he's doing it in front of 500 people. He said he's having a ball.
Yeah.
Dad, we have a show to put on. You know, I just wanted to introduce you as maybe a song or two, but the people wanted to hear. Anyhow, it was kind of funny. And it left him, you know, with his chest just out like a rooster.
I bet.
Sure.
Yeah. And so obviously, you'd listen to the kind of music your father would sing. What about your mother? Did she like any particular kind of music that was different, or she'd listen to pretty much whatever your father would listen to?
Well, it wasn't. What was interesting about my parents. Are you okay? It's about dinner time for him. I don't care about that as much as I don't want him to make. He's still young. He's going under. That's okay. I didn't want him to start peeing on the carpet.
Sure.
I didn't know if he needed to go out, but if he's under like this, you can't tell. But I'm petting him right now. I think my mother, in a way, took a back seat to my father's gifts, because she was a beautiful singer on her own. and she could harmonize on her own. I don't know if my father could harmonize.
Yeah.
And and yet, and so when they sang together, it was beautiful. And when we all sang together, it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But I'm going to give you another example. My mom could do pretty much what my dad could do, but my mom might have let him do it.
I see.
He was into ping pong. He loved ping pong. He was in a club. He had his own paddle. He would play every week. And he taught me how to play ping pong. Why is that important? Because my mother could play ping pong. And the only person that could beat my father was my mother. My mother could beat my father in ping pong. And, you know, she didn't make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
But it's like, you know, she was a tennis player. She was a ping pong player. But she let my dad do his thing. And the same with singing. That's really why I was bringing that up. I think my mom could have stood on her own.
Yeah.
But that she didn't need that.
Sure.
She didn't need that part of the limelight. So my father glowed in that. All my parents glowed in that. And eventually, you know, I took that on the road. And so when I was in Georgetown, I was singing in clubs.
Yeah.
And when I was in Colorado, when I moved to Colorado, I was singing in clubs. And that's where we had the concert with you know, we had 3 years of concerts with about 500 people.
Yeah.
With another doc. So it was called, instead of 3 Dog Night, we would call it 2 Doc Night.
Would you mostly play folk music?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jackson Brown, Jim could play the guitar and the piano. He could play anything on the piano. So we were able to expand beyond guitar.
Sure.
And so Jackson Brown, Joan Baez, I was never very hard, meaning I loved Bob Dylan's words,
Yeah.
but I couldn't stand his voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
so the Byrds singing Turn, 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 Joan Baez singing Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell was wonderful, Judy Collins was from here, from Denver. And went to the same school as my kids, actually. John Denver. So it was folk music.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, in a way, Steven, I was an Oreo.
Yeah.
You've heard that term.
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't really get introduced to more Black stuff until later in life.
Okay, I see.
And that's because I didn't need to.
Yeah.
Because I was born early enough that part of some of your questions was, how did you feel about being Black or whatever? How did you integrate that in your life? I didn't. I didn't see me as different. I didn't even think about it, really.
Yeah.
There were so many other things that I had, attributes that I had.
Sure.
Black was one of them, but I didn't consider myself Black then because I didn't take a side.
Yeah.
And Huey Newton wasn't around then, and Malcolm wasn't around then. And so when I was going to college, we didn't have, later on, there was Black is Beautiful, and we had to take a side. And I would scratch my head early when this started, and I would go, well, wait a minute. I don't want to put down my mom and my mom's side. I don't want to put down my dad and my dad's side.
Yeah.
But I'm supposed to take a stand. Luckily that I didn't have to do that.
Sure.
Until later on when I was strong enough to know who I was.
Yeah.
And I wanted everybody to know who I was. And
Sure.
so, as an example, in medical school, in residency, I remember there's a picture of me somewhere where I had a Angela Davis fro. So you could, there were 2 black people in the residency fucking program. Sorry,
Oh my
Jesus.
God.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
2 people in the residency program, and they couldn't distinguish between the 2 of us. They
Oh
would
my
call me
God.
Jim, and they would call, are you Jim or are you Peter? Oh, come on, man. I mean, do we really, we don't look anything near
That's
alike. I mean,
insane.
Jim was 100% black,
Yeah.
and I was 50%.
Yeah.
So the idea, it's like, come
Wow.
on, people.
Yeah. So it's been very interesting so far because people who came of age in the Coops, say in the 40s, had a certain experience where, you know, the color of their skin was something that was very apparent to them. But it is very interesting because it seems like by the 50s, 60s, the people I have spoken with who came from either, you know, families where both parents were black or families where one parent was black and the other was white, that they had a much more complicated relationship with racial identity. That it wasn't made as apparent that that they were different from other people at the Coops. Maybe outside of the Coops in certain instances, but often, at least from what I've heard people say, you can tell me about your experience with this. It'd be because they were from the Coops and not necessarily because they were black or because they were Jewish or whatever it might be. It was more because of all of the you know, loaded nature of coming from the Coops, whatever things that might mean in, you know, people who lived on Pelham Parkway's mind. But it was more of the Coops identity.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I had any experience with the Coops as an issue that other people brought up, other than the ALP thing that Stephen Abeck outed me and said, "Oh, your parents go to the," which again, Stephen was a block away,
Yeah,
but a block away was ideologically very, very different.
sure.
And there are a number of ways I could go. I'm laughing because I didn't even know which way I want to go in this,
Yeah.
unless you want to direct me.
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, let's dwell on I guess your experience of racial identity as much as you can remember it as a child and teenager for a while. It sounds from what you've already said that it really didn't become more of a burning question in your mind until maybe residency or maybe just med school in general. But yeah, what was your experience like coming from a you know, biracial family that you remember growing up?
Well, I had friends who were living in the coops, like Paul Jurgens, and the problem with people like Paul and Stephen and Larry Morton, they were older than I was,
Yeah, yeah,
and so they tolerated me. But you know, that was what they were doing,
yeah.
was tolerating a younger kid. They would tease me. Um, and when I say tease me, when we went to Unity, I remember one time Larry and Paul were in a rowboat with me, and they decided that they were going to scare me, and so they started to rock the boat. You know, that's the kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Nothing more.
yeah,
Uh, so my friends were, I felt like I was colorblind.
yeah,
until it came up and Peter, you need to take a stand. And eventually I did take a stand
Sure.
because I felt like I wanted to be looked at as Black.
Yeah.
I didn't see that as a put down.
Yeah.
I didn't take advantage of it. I know that I could have taken advantage of it in terms of some of the programs that were being offered at that time, a little later on, in terms of getting into school with a different grade than if you were non-Black, non-minority. But I never took advantage of that. And I just didn't get into school the first time around. So we've been at this for about an hour and a half. There's a lot more that I could talk to you about. I'm thinking though that at 6 o'clock, my time, 8 o'clock, your time, that maybe we should continue this on another time.
Yeah.
Unless you can think, I mean, I'm not looking at you right now because I'm looking at things like movie theaters. It was the Allerton.
Sure. Yeah. And
25 cents. A nickel
Yeah.
or 25 cents or something like that. 2 shows.
Would you go there very frequently?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
it was still the situation where you'd pay 25 cents and you said you get to see two shows or
it would be a double feature.
Yeah. And what about I mean this ties in just in general with family culture, but what about foods that you remember eating in your household growing up?
Monday night was down home night. So we had hominy grits.
Mm.
You know, I mean, who eats grits in the North? We did. We did.
Yeah.
On Monday nights, we had grits and either salmon croquettes or something like that.
Yeah.
My mom was not a good cook.
Mm.
My father, on the other hand, was incredible.
Mm.
He learned from his mom, who was a domestic.
Yeah.
And you know, I remember my grandmother, who lived in the middle of the hood on 135th Street. I remember asking her, please tell me how you make this coconut cake.
Yeah.
Well, honey, you just put a pinch of this in, and then you take about that much of that, and you put some butter in there, and hold on, Grandma, pinch of this, and you know, it was all up here.
Yeah,
and there was no measuring of anything.
For
and
sure.
She would taste it, and whatever she would do, it would come out the most delicious coconut cake that, you know, you would ever taste. My father could do this, something similar.
Yeah.
My father would make fried chicken. The way he'd make fried chicken is that the chicken would be in there, and he'd be talking to you, and he'd be salting it. So he'd be salting the chicken, talking to you. He'd stop talking to you, turn around, look at the chicken, and realize that he needs to put salt in it. So I had Kentucky Fried Chicken before KFC.
Sure.
I had, you know, lip smacking, finger licking good chicken or whatever he made.
Yeah.
But he didn't cook all the time. My mom did a lot of the cooking, daily cooking, but it was my father who had the flavor.
Yeah.
And so, we did have grits and we did have greens. We had collard greens. So I was able to experience some of that and loved Mondays because of that.
Sure.
Because it was so different. And then when we did have what, quote, Jewish food,
Yeah.
uh, my kids were trying to find other things to eat because sardine paste just didn't go down well with them. And kreplach, and the number of things that you had for special occasions. What was the soup? The uh,
Is it matzo ball soup or?
matzo ball soup.
Yeah.
I liked it. I loved it. I don't even want to know what's in a matzo ball. But my kids, when they were in Puerto Rico, and my mom would be cooking, and my mom would have hors d'oeuvres, thinking that it was special. My kids were like, "Dad, could you eat it for us, please? Because I don't want to insult Grandma, but I can't eat this."
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean this has been another very interesting aspect of, the little cultural bubble of the Coop is the crossover in some cases, or uncomfortable coexistence of Southern soul food and Eastern European Jewish food. In some cases, I don't think in some families melded too well, but I've heard of some families where some very unique fusion cuisine kind of emerged from it. So yeah, it's another very interesting thing always to ask about with the Coops, especially. Interesting in general, but and you mentioned your grandma on your dad's side, so they moved up to New York too, I guess, eventually.
Not together. Right? That's what we're trying to understand. I mean, Stephen, there's some weird stuff that Jackie has come up with. My father was born in Mississippi, we believe, and that's true.
Sure.
Somehow, though, when he was asked at some other point in time, he said Prescott, Arizona.
Oh, huh.
And we can't figure out why.
Huh.
But it's on the record, in the record. Jackie has been following this, and we're scratching our heads trying to come up with a cohesive story as to why that might have been there, and was he hiding, or what was going on?
Yeah.
I should tell you, Stephen, that my cousins were very much more involved with going over to Spain.
Yeah.
And the Spanish Civil War, and coming back and having to go underground because of the Smith Act. You know what the Smith Act
Absolutely.
might have been.
Yeah.
It defined communist as someone who's trying to overthrow the government by force and violence. Therefore, there's no trial necessary if you fall under those guidelines. And so my cousins, the Klonskys, had to go underground. And Bob Klonsky and other people like that had to go underground.
Wow.
All of my family members on the mother's side, whether it be Chicago or California, were of the same ilk.
Yeah.
They believed the same thing. Especially Helen and Bob, who are in California, who had Mike and whatever Mike's brother's name, Freddie. What was interesting was even then, Bob Klonsky was a Soviet believer, communist.
Sure.
Mike, his son, was a Chinese believer.
Yeah.
And so it was like this.
Yeah.
The two of them could not see eye to eye.
Yeah.
You had to have some sort of fight, with your father on something, and they seemed to pick that. I think what happens in a lot of people's lives is that there's a bull, the dad, and there's a calf. And at some point, the calf wants to become a bull of his own. And so there may be tension at that point until there's resolution.
Sure.
And so I could see that with my parents, with my father. And I really wish that we could have had more time where he was lucid and understood and really had a good conversation. But by the time I was free enough to do that, his mind was not.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like it was fair to go over things.
Sure.
You know, I wanted to meet with a psychologist so we could try to get closer. And that would have meant him coming to Denver or me going to someplace.
Yeah.
So that didn't happen.
And I'm guessing he never spoke much about his life in Mississippi to you.
Well, that's the problem,
Yeah.
is that we didn't have much of a chance. No, we didn't have much of a chance.
Yeah.
And again, if I were younger, my son has 20-year-olds. My daughter has 10-year-olds. And so they're both the same age, my son and my daughter.
Yeah.
So the ones that are my daughter's kids, they'll be able to have more time to leave home, come back, and their parents might still be young enough.
Sure.
Whereas, you know, my 50-year-old, 52-year-old son has a 21, 20, 19-year-old daughters. And in 20 years, when they're through with whatever they were doing and they come back, you know, he'll be 70 or whatever. And so that's a difference.
Yeah.
That's what happened with me.
Yeah.
Is that I flew the coop because that's where I was ridiculously lucky. And there's a story that I would like to tell you if we could talk about this the next time.
Sure.
And that is how I went from college, and avoided the Vietnam War and went to Georgetown.
Let me just make note of that so I'll know to pick up on that next time.
And that is where I would say that I don't believe in miracles, but I have to scratch my head and go, what the F happened here? How could this have happened?
Yeah.
And it blows my mind. It might blow yours. But you'll have to wait for the next installment.
Great. Well, yeah, there's definitely much more that I'd love to hear from you, but we've, covered a lot of very, very rich ground tonight. And yeah, thank you for sharing everything.
Sure. Yeah, I can see a lot of questions that we haven't looked at, and I'll try to incorporate that in my answers. But we can start from wherever you'd like to start the next time.
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, I think, now. How's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good.